leave your questions in the Q&A and or in the chat. Dr. Fischer, good evening.
Good evening, good evening, good evening.
Good evening.
Where is our guest? Disappeared somewhere.
Yeah, like he was here a minute ago.
Under Farizi Bigjan or separately?
No, he was here just a minute ago. Hello, Eyck. Are you back?
I'm back.
Ah.
So shall we start?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Good evening, dear ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, dear participants. Good evening, dear guests. Good evening, all the colleagues and students and all the audience. We are very happy to continue our series of guest lectures under the Global Leadership Forum. The Global Leadership Forum was initiated with Dr. Bank and the Board of Trustees of Kemap University, and the initiative was launched last October, and our guest lecture started this semester in spring 2021. And we're so happy to and so honored to have all distinguished guests talking to our audience and sharing their thoughts.
So it is a great pleasure to introduce Mr. Eyck Freymann, the author of the book One Belt, One Road, Chinese Power Meets the World, that was published at Harvard in 2020. Mr. Eyck Freymann is a director of Indo-Pacific at Greenmantle, an investment strategy and advisory firm. And Mr. Freymann is a Doctor of Philosophy candidate in China Studies at the University of Oxford. He holds the MPhil from the University of Cambridge, where he was the Henry Scholar. Mr. Eyck also holds the master degree in Asian Studies from Harvard University, where he won the Joseph Fletcher Memorial Prize for Best Thesis, and the bachelor degree in East Asian History with the highest honors from Harvard College. His research and commentary have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Economist, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy. And we are very glad to have Mr. Eyck Freymann today at the QMAP Global Leadership Forum with the talk on One Belt, One Road, China and Central Asia. So the platform is yours.
Thank you so much, Janat and Alma, for hosting me. I am thrilled that you could all take your evening to Zoom in and listen to what I have to say. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes or so, probably not longer. And if I do ramble longer, I'd encourage you to give me a nudge in the chat. I want to keep time at the end for questions and interaction with all of you. I want to hear what you're thinking about. Hopefully this will be a new approach to a topic that you have heard about before. And so I would encourage you to ask difficult questions and for this to be a multi-sided dialogue. Let me jump into the presentation now. So I'm going to be speaking today on the One Belt, One Road initiative, but specifically what it means for Central Asia. I'm going to be sharing some information from my new book. It's available on Amazon, perhaps rather expensive to have shipped to Kazakhstan, but hopefully I will entice you to learn more about it. I begin with not only with a plug for myself, but also because I think you can judge this book by its cover. The cover tells you in a single image what you need to know, I believe, about One Belt, One Road, which is that it is not only about building infrastructure, it is also about manufacturing an image for Chinese President Xi Jinping himself as a sort of neo-emperor. So he's wearing the infrastructure, as it were, as an emperor's new clothes. And I'm going to argue that One Belt, One Road is, in addition to being an infrastructure, finance, and development campaign, actually, in addition, a Chinese domestic political campaign to achieve national imperial rejuvenation and to put Xi Jinping at the center, not only of this new China, but also of a new regional and global order. So part of what is being done under the umbrella of One Belt, One Road is ideological re-education inside China, in which the history of the ancient Silk Road is being rewritten to fall into line with what Xi Jinping is trying to do. And it's that I want to speak about today, because I think it has profound implications for all of you as China's neighbors in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, from the very beginning, has had a special place in this initiative. Xi Jinping announced it in September 2013 on a visit to Astana, standing next to former President Nazarbayev. And he described it as an effort to recreate the ancient Silk Road. He said, as he gave his speech announcing it, I can almost, when I close my eyes, hear the ring of the camel bells coming through the sands in the desert. And sure enough, this initiative grew out of a decades-long Chinese effort to integrate itself with Central Asia. Part of that was about acquiring access to the amazing wealth of natural resources that exists in Kazakhstan. But part of it also had to do with the political relationships with people like President Nazarbayev and other Central Asian leaders, making sure that those relationships were so strong that Chinese access to those resources would be secure over the long term. But this was about more than foreign policy, and this became quite clear in China in the first 5 years of Xi Jinping's presidency. In 2017, at the National Party Congress, where Xi Jinping removed term limits, effectively allowing himself to rule for life, one of the things he did to perform his power was to write Xi Jinping thought into the National Party Constitution. Right next to it, he wrote in One Belt, One Road. So these two things in the Chinese mind are linked. One Belt, One Road is more than something about infrastructure. It is a slogan that is going to carry Xi Jinping into the history books. This is not a new thing in China. In fact, Mao Zedong was the master of it. This is a propaganda poster from the Cultural Revolution, where we see Mao presented as the latest in a long line of communist visionaries and leaders, beginning with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and continuing through Lenin and Stalin. Similarly, Xi Jinping has picked his own historical avatar, who he's trying to align himself with and be compared with. That man is Han Di, who is widely regarded as one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history. He ruled for over 5 decades in the Han Dynasty more than 2,000 years ago. And he oversaw an extraordinary expansion of Chinese power. Under Han Di's reign, the Han Dynasty invaded the Korean Peninsula successfully. It annexed many of the southern provinces that are now the core of the Chinese economy, including what is now Hong Kong and parts of what is now northern Vietnam. And most importantly, though Han Di never lived to see it through, he undertook the beginning of a colonial expansion into what they called the Western regions, which are now the Chinese provinces of Gansu. If you can see my cursor here, this is the Hexi corridor. And then on the left of this image, the modern day province of Xinjiang and parts of what is today Kazakhstan. Han Di also oversaw a golden age of Chinese culture, a massive economic expansion. He's a good guy to be compared to. If you ask the average Chinese person on the street who is the greatest emperor in Chinese history, it's a reasonably good chance that they will name Han Di. But of all of the glorious achievements that Han Di did, one of the things he did not do was found the ancient Silk Road. And the reason, as you may have learned in school yourselves, is that the ancient Silk Road was not a single route. It was not a political project or a Chinese invention. It was an ambiguous, shifting network of trading routes that went through Central Asia, sometimes north to south, sometimes east to west. And they rose and fell and shifted over time. This was the common understanding of what the Silk Road was in Europe, in China, throughout the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th. And then this man changed everything. Sven Hedin was a Swede. He was a confidant and personal friend of Adolf Hitler, and he was an amateur orientalist who conducted various archaeological expeditions in Central Asia and China in the first part of the 20th century. And among Hedin's ideas was that the Nazi Germans should partner with the Chinese nationalists and build a trans-Eurasian trade corridor of railways and roads and flight routes. And in order to persuade the nationalist Chinese that this was a good idea, bear in mind they were fighting a war with Japan at this point, he concocted a pseudo-history of the ancient Silk Road, in which it was actually a Chinese geopolitical project founded by Han Di, that great emperor who everybody knew. When Hedden wrote this book and proposed this theory, Chinese historians laughed him out of the room. They actually called his idea the Suowei Sulu, the so-called Silk Road, because in Chinese historical thought, there was never such a thing as a Silk Road at all. But the metaphor stuck. And over the course of the first decades of the People's Republic of China, after the communists took over in 1949, you can find occasional references to the term Silk Road, which is the Chinese just translated word for word from the German, 丝绸之路, literally Silk Road, but a German scholar had coined it. And the Chinese would use that as a metaphor for friendly relations between China and Central Asia that were improved and lubricated by trade. But it wasn't until after Xi Jinping took power in 2016 that China's Ministry of Education revised all of the national history books. All of the textbooks that every Chinese secondary school student must memorize and regurgitate in order to pass the university entrance exam. And part of the new history involved throwing out the understanding that had lasted for hundreds of years, that the Silk Road was a network of trade routes that emerged gradually over time. Because what Xi Jinping wanted to do was to create an ancient Silk Road history that would be in line with what he wants to do today. And so, sure enough, he made Han Di the great visionary leader. And in his telling, this was all about Han Di figuring out a way to conquer the barbarians in the West who were threatening the Han domains, and to pacify the local tribes, either to persuade them to buy them off to fight the Huns, or to show them that China was sufficiently committed with its military to the region that they would have no choice but to submit. So this is being projected inside China as very much a project of national restoration. It's about showing muscle to the countries on the periphery and driving away anyone who would threaten Chinese power. This is a 60-second clip that will give you a taste of how this is being spun to Chinese language audiences. Let's give it a watch. I'll translate the Chinese language into English.
这是一条让我能触摸祖先的路。
This is a road that can help us connect to our ancestors. It is full of opportunity here. This place is overflowing with wealth. It brings wealth to our nation. It brings light to us. I'm here to serve my hometown. Connecting heart to heart. Very soon I'll see the train traveling and I'll use it. A brand new Asia. Our tomorrow will be better. One Belt, One Road. And the characters underneath say large-scale documentary film. Are you excited yet? Let's walk through what the movie has to say. First of all, this is no regular piece of propaganda. This is a series that was produced in 2016, aired on Chinese Central Television, the national network on which the Communist Party presents its official accounting of the day's news. And It begins with cameo appearances from many of the world's leading dignitaries. Henry Kissinger, former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, Vladimir Putin, the former prime ministers of France and Italy, the sitting president of Belarus, and many other senior dignitaries. In case you had any doubt that this was produced with the highest levels of official backing from the foreign ministry, there's no way they could have booked Kissinger and Putin unless this was the real deal. And then the bulk of the propaganda film is about spinning Xi Jinping's speech in Kazakhstan in 2013 as the culmination of a 2,000-year process of Chinese imperial power, rising and falling, and then rising again. Here's the basic concept. China has a secret sauce to its civilization. They call it Dongfang Zhihui, or Oriental wisdom. And this is a notion of not only how to govern China, but how to relate Chinese power to other countries in the region. It's why we are told China always wants to trade with its neighbors and it never wants to invade them. The Westerners, by contrast, are portrayed as completely hapless, unable to do calculations. This is a white guy in a toga pretending to be the Greek astronomer Eratosthenes, who miscalculates the size of the Earth. So, as we are told, the Westerners are hopelessly behind in technology. Hanu Di, on the left here, it has the bright idea to found the Silk Road. And so he is now ordering his loyal servant, Zhang Qian, to go take a journey into the Western regions and recruit Central Asian peoples in what is modern-day Xinjiang and Kazakhstan to join him in building this Silk Road trade network. Zhang Qian, of course, is portrayed as the loyal servant who goes through all of these sufferings and ordeals overseas, but it is worth it because together, the Lord and the servant establish a period of unparalleled power, wealth, and unity inside China. So their mission succeeds. Chinese products make it to the West. And all of a sudden, these goofy Westerners are holding Chinese silk in their hands. And we're treated to a minute-long montage as the Romans touch this silk. They've never seen anything so beautiful before, and they decide they must get access at any cost to the Chinese market so they can get Chinese products. They can't live without them. And so this breaks open not only a trade network, what we think of as the Silk Road, but also a metaphor for international cooperation that will last for over 1,000 years. The documentary calls this the Silk Road spirit, the Sizhou Zhulu Jingshan. So we're told this, similar to Oriental wisdom, is a metaphor for how if you are trading with China and getting access to its goods, you will want no conflict with China, and China will want no conflict with you. So it's a win-win, right? Everyone gets rich and everyone can live in harmony. Unfortunately, the documentary tells us, the Westerners are so eager to find a faster way to China that they find the New World instead. And this takes world history on a scary, destructive, ultimately failed detour. The Europeans embark on this path of colonial expansion and trade monopoly. They invent this idea of Western individualism, representative democracy, and capitalism, which is win-lose. In other words, we win, you lose. And at this point in the film, the music gets dark and frightening. There's locomotives running people down. The evil virus of Western civilization takes over the world. Ecological destruction wrecks the climate. There's war, there's chaos, there's suffering. And even the United States is depicted as a complete mess. This is Times Square after a parade or something, but the streets are covered with trash. So fortunately, the Chinese Communist Party has emerged to help the Chinese people stand up and share their Oriental wisdom again with the world. And at this point, the music gets hopeful. We're now in the mid-20th century. new third world nations in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America are newly independent and they're rejoicing, but they don't know what to do. They don't have the secret for development, so they look to China for leadership. And sure enough, China answers the call, skipping over the Maoist period where so many tens of millions died because of the Communist Party's counterproductive agricultural policies, skipping over the Cultural Revolution. Boom, we are in the late 1970s, and the Chinese economic juggernaut is taking off. At this point, the music gets rat-a-tat. It gets hopeful and exciting, and it speeds up. We get this run of charts showing the inexorable rise of Chinese economic power. This is foreign exchange reserves, but we're showing how they go from technologically behind in the course of a 30-second montage to making cars, to making high-speed rail, to making airplanes, to taking over outer space. So China is back, baby, is the message. We once again have the technology. What Silk was 2,000 years ago is maybe Huawei today. We've got it, and the world wants it. So what is Central Asia's role in all of this? Well, Central Asians are depicted through the guise of characters like this, who's a little girl named Karina. She lives in Kyrgyzstan, and we're told she lives in this backwards little town that is disconnected, and the only trains that ever go through her town are freight trains that go very slow, and she wants to take the fast train and see what's out there. Well, guess what? China's got fast trains. So this is what China is offering. What do they get in return? Submission, performances of gratitude. This is MPhil. He's a herdsman in Mongolia. We are told that his, quote, primitive existence on the grassland was transformed by Chinese help. And he forms this friendship with a Chinese engineer named Mr. Wang. And the Mongolians, of course, can't do anything right. Their generator keeps breaking, plunging their village into darkness. But Mr. Wang, even if it's a night or a weekend, will go across the border, will find the part, or will buy the part or custom make the part so that the electrical generator can be fixed and light can be brought back to MPhil's village. So what's in it for the Chinese businesses, the Chinese construction workers that are going to sacrifice so much and take so many risks for the Belt and Road project? Well, it's simple. Zhang Qian, the hero of the ancient Silk Road, who so loyally served his master even though he was taken prisoner in Central Asia and didn't see his family for over a decade. Because he served so well and advanced the national purpose, he was written into the history books to be memorialized for all time. And we are told Chinese construction workers who participate in the building of Belt and Road projects around the world will be put in museums and celebrated as national heroes, just as Zhang Qian was. Now, when China tries to explain this to foreigners, particularly to Westerners, it takes a slightly different approach. There's none of the references to national rejuvenation. There's no references at all to Hanudi. To capture this, let me just show it to you. I think it's quite creepy and a little bit fun.
A few years ago, China's President Shi Zhiqin proposed making new routes. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative. More stuff can move around the world more easily. People can travel more easily and build things countries need.
Such as where movies are around?
I'll tell you tomorrow, sweetie, okay? It's time for you to go to sleep.
Okay, Papa.
Hey, Lily.
You said the Belt and Road wasn't just about moving stuff from country to country. What do you mean?
Okay, I'll tell you. It's not just about roads and rails and airports to move stuff. It's also about people and cooperation.
What kind of cooperation?
Lots of kinds. Countries make deals about buying and selling things. And they visit each other's countries. They even go to each other's schools.
Like how I'm American and I go to school in Beijing.
A lot like that. The United States has a joint initiative
Is that because it's too far away?
Actually, any country, anywhere,
How?
they make agreements with China and the other countries.
That is a Chinese initiative, right?
It's China's idea, but it belongs to the world.
What do you mean?
Look, sweetie, it's time for you to get to sleep. I'll tell you tomorrow, okay?
Okay.
You can see the difference between this and the propaganda for Chinese audiences. This is so warm and fuzzy that even a child could understand it and recognize that it's a good thing. It's the concept of win-win. That's how it is presented to foreigners, while to domestic audiences, the same process is presented as imperial restoration. So, what's wrong with all this? Why can't we let the Chinese have their domestic campaign to glorify Xi Jinping, to make him out to be a new emperor? If the Chinese are actually offering projects which are win-win, if they're building infrastructure in Kazakhstan, transportation between cities, they're developing mines and natural resource extraction, they're helping to develop and diversify the Kazakh economy, what's so wrong? Why not just attend the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing and raise a glass with Xi Jinping to toast to common friendship? Well, Kazakhstan has a very special place in the Belt and Road, but one reason for that is that it is right next to Xinjiang, a Chinese province where a brutal campaign of repression is ongoing against Muslim minorities. And it is impossible to ignore the fact that when China tries to get Kazakhstan to interact with the Belt and Road and to say nice things about the Belt and Road, it is not just seeking a political partnership to do joint economic development. It has its own political purposes, its own domestic purposes here too, which is it wants to show its own people, amongst others, that the people of Kazakhstan are okay with what is happening in Xinjiang. And this puts the Kazakh government in a very difficult position. On the one hand, China is one of its most important trading partners, and there's so much to be gained from this economic partnership. On the other hand, there are ethnic Kazakhs too who are suffering in the camps, and we know this from some who have escaped and told their stories. And it's not just Kazakhstan. China is using the Belt and Road framework as a way to buy off the leaders of almost every major Muslim country. This is the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman on the Great Wall of China. The last time he visited Beijing, he signed a joint communique on public security, which was all but explicitly endorsing what the Communist Party is doing in Xinjiang. So this is a playbook that has worked very effectively for China, dangling economic benefits or threatening economic repercussions to countries to buy their silence on the Xinjiang issue. Kazakhstan is not really in a position where it could break away from all the others and speak out, but it should understand that this is, to a large degree, what the Belt and Road is trying to do. It's also worth noting that the Russians, even though they pretend to be really excited about the Belt and Road, have always been quite concerned. In fact, we know from interviews that were conducted with Russian intelligence officials and defense officials that in the first years of the Belt and Road program, particularly 2013 to 2016, there was a lot of fear in Russia that China was trying to, this is a quote, steal Central Asia from us. The idea is that the Chinese have all of this money, the Russian Far East is underdeveloped, Russia can't afford to compete with China dollar for dollar on these projects. So what options does Russia have to contain it? Well, particularly after the Ukraine crisis in 2014, when the Russian economy entered free fall, Vladimir Putin had no options. And so he made a deal with Xi Jinping to link up the Eurasian Economic Union, Russia's own commercial bloc and trading bloc, with the Belt and Road. But this is more in name or in theory than in practice. What Belt and Road projects has Russia actually allowed inside its own borders? Well, there's this project at Yamal. It's a natural gas facility, and there's a number of pipelines that connect timber but particularly natural gas from the Russian Far East to China. But many of the projects that involve China investing in Russia's critical infrastructure, for example, a rail link between Moscow and St. Petersburg, or excuse me, between Moscow and Kazan, has not actually gone through because Putin has interfered with the project to make sure that it doesn't happen. So the Russians are very cautious, and what they would like to do is strike some sort of balance with China so that without having to exhaust all of their national resources investing in Central Asia, there is some form of balance of power. And countries like Kazakhstan, like Mongolia, like all of the Central Asian republics, don't become Chinese client states. The other reason that the Russians are concerned about the Belt and Road is that this Chinese promise to build a trade route connecting China to Europe over land, including rail links, sounds a lot like a plan to put the Trans-Siberian Railroad out of business. And the Russians have been concerned about this for a long time because many of the cities and towns in the Russian Far East are sustained by the economy of the Trans-Siberian. And this is one reason why the Russians have worked quietly and behind the scenes to slow down the development of Trans-Eurasian rail links built by the Chinese. And one thing that they've done is they've made sure that the rail gauge, the width between the rails and the railway in some of the Central Asian republics is different from the ones used in China. And that slows down the process of moving a train load across, and it also makes it more expensive. China has responded by heavily subsidizing these railroads. They subsidize them when they build them, and then this is a list of hidden subsidies that Chinese states, Chinese cities and provinces have, so that goods made within their jurisdiction can get to Europe in a cheap way over land. But the point is, this is not an economically feasible thing to do at scale. The Chinese do not seriously think that overland rail transport is going to replace maritime transport. So there will be some trade that goes east to west across Kazakhstan, but it's not going to become the major transportation hub of the global economy between China and Europe. And there have been many reports of Chinese trains that are going to Europe, and the containers, when they're inspected, are actually empty because the companies are subsidized to take containers, but they don't have the goods to put inside. And I'm not a particular expert on the Khorgos Gateway. I've never been able to visit the project in person, but from what I've heard, it is operating far below capacity, even though its throughput hit a record this year. And China has its own domestic financial issues. In fact, if you track the amount of money that China has spent, FDI is foreign direct investment. This is money into projects like Khorgos. And you look over the course of the last 20 years, you see a very rapid expansion, peaking in 2015-16, and then a similarly rapid decline. And there's a number of reasons for this. But if you close read the statements coming from Shi Jinping and other Chinese state planners, they just had an important meeting called the Lianghui, where they came out with a new 5-year plan and set a bunch of economic targets. They don't seem to be as committed to building new heavy infrastructure like railroads and inland ports as they used to be. And so while they are still promising trade and other kinds of economic benefits to Kazakhstan, it's not quite as much as they were previously suggesting, where it used to be plausible that this line could continue going up and up and up as far as the eye can see. But now that doesn't seem so likely, particularly if there's an economic or financial crisis inside China. So what does this mean for Kazakhstan? It means it is a coercive geopolitical force. The Belt and Road is about Chinese national rejuvenation, imperial rejuvenation, and part of that is extending control over Central Asia, just as China had at the height of its imperial power. It means offering economic goodies and favors to elites in partner countries to get these places on board, so they will say nice things about China and help China look good on the world stage, but also to its own people. And it comes with risks, because if you don't want to be like that Mongolian herdsman and have to toast and thank the Chinese for everything they give you, Kazakhstan is going to have to think very hard about what its options are and how it can have alternative sources of support so that it is not so dependent on China. My suggestion is that Kazakhstan should continue to cooperate with China. Some Americans might not agree. Americans don't like the Belt and Road, generally speaking, for all of the obvious reasons, but I don't think Kazakhstan has much of an alternative. It also has a lot to gain from China, from trade with China, from getting technological transfers from China, from people-to-people exchanges with China. Kazakhstan is just too close to China's borders to ignore its neighbor. And so it should seek to benefit when there are win-win opportunities to be found. But my advice, speaking as a friend, is don't become dependent. Investigate other sources of support, if that's Russia, the United States, the European Union. Make relations with India, actively pursue a role in multilateral organizations like the United Nations, bring people from the private sector, from multilateral development banks to come visit Kazakhstan, so that when the Chinese propose doing a project, you know exactly what it is that you are signing up for. I'm going to pause now and thank you very much for listening. I've seen some really interesting questions in the chat, so looking forward to opening up to the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Eyck Freymann. It was really interesting conversation, and since we're in this region, of course, this is very important to us to really understand what's going on. And we have one question from Daniel Mashakov. I would like to start with this question. Dear Eyck, what are the real reasons behind the Belt Road Initiative? It even became the part of Chinese constitution, which seems unnatural for such projects. It cannot be solely economic by the common sense.
Thank you. So that's a fair question. I think I have offered a theory for what the Belt and Road is that is more persuasive than what others have proposed. I think the earliest and probably most common explanation is it is an economic program. In other words, China has a very well-developed model for building infrastructure. They've done a lot of it at home in the last 20, 30 years. They have these enormous state-owned industries that make steel and concrete. And so they have a glut. They have more of these materials than they know what to do with. They also have lots of cheap labor. And so they had that on the one hand, and lots of capital sitting around on the other hand, money that they had saved exporting to the West. And so starting in the early to mid 2000s, they said, well, let's go abroad and let's put these to work, right? Let's use the money to lend to partner countries. And in return, we'll have them hire our state-owned enterprises, and we can use our materials and our labor. And in the process, we can build infrastructure that can help us get access to their natural resources. So Kazakhstan, as you know, is a breadbasket. It has so many different kinds of natural resources, and China would like to use them, manufacture them into finished products, and sell them at a higher price to the rest of the world, particularly the developed world. So that is an economic theory of what the Belt and Road is. There's another sort of geoeconomic theory, which is it's a debt trap. This is the Trump administration's approach, that it's actually all a ruse, it's all a lie. It's not trying to build this infrastructure. It's just trying to, it's going fishing for stupid little small countries that are irresponsible enough to bite at the cheap money, at the promise of immediate rewards. And they think they're going to get rich, but they actually get more debt than they can pay off. And the Chinese acquired land or critical infrastructure in their country. Now that has been basically totally debunked. I debunk it in my book, but now that the Trump administration is out of power and scholars can speak freely, it's now becoming quite obvious that there is no clear-cut examples on earth of the Chinese doing this. Certainly there's many projects that were poorly thought out, that were not going to make money, that the Chinese funded. And that was probably because they wanted political relationships with elites in those countries. So that's the economic explanation for it. I think that a much more persuasive explanation for it is that this is a classic Mao-style mass mobilization. The Communist Party has a long history of this, which is that the government sets out a slogan that describes a concept or an idea, a direction. They throw the frisbee and all of the dogs run after the frisbee. And some go to the right, some go to the left, some run too far. But in general, all of the different actors, the provinces, the cities, the towns, the state-owned enterprises, the private businesses, the universities, the think tanks, all move basically in that direction, and they experiment, and some of them do a good job and they're rewarded and celebrated, and others do a not very good job and they're punished or they're hushed up. And I think this is a better way to think about it, because Mao used mass mobilization campaigns many times during his decades in power, and it helped him crush the opposition. It helped him establish himself as the single central force in the country. It helped him eliminate opposition within the Communist Party because Mao was paranoid of being overthrown. Xi Jinping, likewise, has a lot of enemies within the Chinese Communist Party system. And from the very beginning of his time in power, he has used the similar toolkit to root out his opponents, to punish them publicly, to put his name and his face on things, because he believes that this sort of stature, this sort of position in the public imagination will protect him and keep him in power at home. So I think it is impossible to deny the legitimacy that Xi Jinping gets for a Chinese audience when foreign leaders come to Beijing and they stand on the red carpet with him and they beg for Belt and Road money. It makes him seem like the big man, and it allows him to take a system which, when he inherited it, was very decentralized, and try to impose discipline and order on it by saying, no, you can lend money, you can do projects, you can invest overseas, and so forth, but only if you do it according to my concept, which is this Belt and Road concept. So I think this is the way that we should think about what it is about. It is about securing Xi Jinping's place in the Chinese system, and in the process, rejuvenating, restoring the glory and status and power and influence and technological sophistication that China had at the height of its imperial period. And the two are connected.
Thank you so much for your answer. And there is another question from Ms. Adana Shomotova. As you know, there are several routes for One Belt, One Road. First is via Central Asia and Kazakhstan. Another one is via Siberia, Russia. So what do you think? What should Kazakhstan do to become a main route for One Belt, One Road? Yida Yilu in Chinese, if I read it correctly, for goods from China to Europe and other parts of the world. Thank you.
So that's a good question. I tried to address that in the second part of my talk. So to restate that in simple language, I don't think, based on my conversations with people in the railway industry and the shipping industry, that overland trade is ever going to be the most cost-effective way to get goods from China to Europe. It is definitely useful. I think something like 5% of Chinese exports to Europe travel by rail, but it is not a significant figure, and it is not growing very quickly. Certainly, what trade there is could go through Kazakhstan, and I think the Kyrgyz Gateway project. I mean, certainly, as I said, I haven't visited myself, but I know people who have visited and inspected the facility, and they say it's very nicely built. Like it's a beautiful facility. If only it were operating at its capacity. I think there are certainly gains that can be made on the margin. And I think that Kazakhstan, which has natural resources that it would like to sell on the global market, will benefit from having trade routes that it can use to get these goods out of the country. But I don't think that in 20 or 30 years, most of the Kazakh economy is going to be servicing a rail route which takes Chinese goods to Europe. This just doesn't seem to be the view of people who work in the shipping and logistics sector. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Eyck. We have one more very interesting question from Kamila Mirvanova. She is asking, hello, Mr. Freymann. Thank you for your presentation. And I have the question. It concerns relations between the Kazakhstan and China. As we know, Kazakhstan is a multicultural country with a predominant population of Muslims. And how is it possible to have adequate geopolitical and economic relations with the country where it is continuing to genocide of Uyghur people for their religion? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that question. Genocide is the correct word. And I was speaking to Alma about this earlier today. I don't know how sensitive it is in Kazakhstan right now to talk about these issues. Certainly in the United States, for the first time in the last few months, we are having a reckoning, thinking about how can we have an economic relationship with China if they do this? How can we tolerate it if our European allies and partners have a relationship with China while they are doing this? And not even really denying it persuasively. And I think this is a very difficult problem for Kazakhstan because there are ethnic Kazakhs in the camps. There are Kazakhstan citizens who we know who have been trapped in these camps. And the Kazakh government has been under intense pressure from Beijing when these people escape, leave to tell their stories, to round them up and send them back to China. And this is a terrible thing, but there are numerous reports of this in the international media. So my answer to this is you need to get the world on the same page about what is and is not acceptable. We learned in the 20th century just how ugly genocide can be, or genocidal ideology can be, if it is not stopped. And we can ask the counterfactual question, if the world had banded together and said what Hitler is talking about in the 1930s is unacceptable, we need to consider ways to limit his regime's participation in international institutions and so forth. Maybe this is the only way to proceed. There are some in the United States who think that way, but I don't think that that is a I don't think that blocking China out is a productive solution. I also don't think that it is a practical solution for Kazakhstan. Like it or not, the world has stood back while China became an extremely wealthy and powerful country and an interconnected part of the global economy. And it is now too late to decouple, to separate our economies totally. We will remain dependent on one another as far as we can see. And I think this is the lesson of the Trump administration. The United States tried a trade war, and we ended up just importing more from China than we did before. So I think human rights does belong at the center of the international conversation about what the Communist Party's methods are and what the world has to do. And I think Kazakhstan needs to be part of that conversation. But I don't think that that means we can just shut the Chinese out or pretend that we can stop trading with them or cooperating with them on issues that matter to all of us. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much. There is another question from our student Baglan Tleshov. There are gossips that say Kazakhstan government wants to sell some pieces of land to China, which may result in building manufacturing plants, migration of Chinese population. In your opinion, what could be the consequences of this agreement for Kazakhstan's economy and demography? Thank you.
This is a frequent topic of conversation when partner countries consider Belt and Road projects, because particularly in a country with a small population, even a few thousand Chinese workers can be a big demographic change. It's important to remember these are guest workers. No one is supporting making these workers citizens. They go home for the Chinese holidays and so forth. But so right now I'm looking, for example, at the case of Greenland. Greenland's entire population is 56,000 people. And to operate the mines that the Chinese want to build there would require literally thousands of Chinese workers. So the Greenlanders' response was, hell no. We want control over our border. We want to be able to vet or supervise who comes in and out. And we want very clear understandings about where they will live and how they will interact with the local community. I think many of these things can be negotiated ahead of time. And I think there is a way to do them if the terms of the project are good in and of themselves. I think there's a way that Kazakhstan can do it in a way that is advantageous. But it's something that has to be looked at very carefully for the obvious reasons that you suggest.
Thank you very much for the answer. And we have also the question related to education from anonymous attendee and Sanjar Alimov. So what do you think about the Chinese education? Why they provide most of Central Asian students with free education? And do they share any ideology to the international students? Thank you.
So China is interested in what they call telling China's story well. They're not like Russia in their overseas propaganda. The Russians, at least when the Russians do propaganda in the United States or the United Kingdom, they are just trying to degrade people's trust in their own government. They're not trying to sell a narrative about what Russia is offering to the world. China is still very interested in identifying the elites of the future in other countries and making sure that they understand China's side of the story. So part of this is the Confucius Institute network, which the Trump administration pushed back very hard against. And then part of it, as you mentioned, is this scholarship program that brings bright young students from all around the world to study in China. I was not one of those students, but I have friends and colleagues who were. Many of them had a very positive experience. They were treated well. They had better, nicer dormitory accommodations than their Chinese peers. They got money to travel around China. They ate good food. They went to parties. They saw the best of what China can offer. And many, though not all, came home with a changed perspective. I think this is an underrated thing. They call this soft power in international relations. And in the people who call themselves realists, who are those who really drive policy in the United States, generally believe that soft power doesn't matter all that much. But soft power does matter. I mean, from Hollywood and blue jeans and Coca-Cola, this was a big part of how the United States won the Cold War. We had a national brand that was more attractive to regular people in the countries where we were, the countries that we were trying to keep from falling into Soviet influence. And the Russians didn't have an equivalently attractive story to tell. There were many factors that resulted in the end of the Cold War, but I think that was one of them. It certainly was the way that we were able to hold the line in places like Europe, Western Europe. So I do think that the United States and other Western countries need to respond to this by inviting more foreign students in, and not just sending them to expensive universities where they get mediocre educations, but making sure that they are shown the best of what Western political values, Western social values are about. And that is the only way that we can counteract what China is doing probably pretty effectively in terms of cultivating friends in places like Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, that most American policymakers don't really think very much about.
Thank you. There is another interesting question from anonymous participant. What particularly and when attracted your attention to this region so much to make it the focus of your professional career?
So I originally wanted to be a Latin America guy. I was just interested in learning about the world. I speak Spanish. That was my intention. And then when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, I took a year off. I had an opportunity to do some work and make some money. And then I decided I have a few months, I'll travel on that money. And I ended up spending a month or two in China and being struck by all of the usual things, the fact that they build cities out of nothing, right? The optimism, the ambition, the energy. And it felt to me like a country that was on a path towards becoming one of the world's most powerful superpowers, if not the world's leading superpower. And I was struck by the way that they use their history, the way that they tell stories about themselves as a society, as a nation. And those stories are central to who they are, right? They say we are 5,000 years of history. We have all of this imperial heritage. The language itself is full of references to Chinese philosophy, to history, to ancient legend. And I started studying the language, and the language was attractive. And I went back to China a couple of years later to work at a think tank in Beijing. And this was the summer of 2015, when the Chinese financial markets were melting down. And I remember it was Beijing, it was disgusting. It's 36 degrees in the shade and humid, and the air is terrible. And I'm sitting in this office reading in the Western media about how this could be the end of the Chinese miracle, right? The stock market is falling apart. This could be the financial crisis that brings it all to an end. And on the television, is the state news, and they're talking about One Belt, One Road. And my response was, wow, well, if this is really so important, that at a time as desperate as this, they're talking about investing billions of dollars in Kazakhstan and other places, this must be really important to Xi Jinping. This must be about this, not the story of a year or two, but the story of a decade or two. And here's a way that I can learn about China, not just by taking classes and reading books just about China, but thinking about patterns of how China interacts with the world and looking at different countries, different regions in a comparative way. And that's how I got the start on this project. And I was just lucky that I grabbed onto it at the right time. And I had amazing opportunities to travel to 4 continents to research this book and to talk to a lot of amazing people. So it was a wonderful experience. At some point, I would like to go to Kazakhstan, to where it all started, but that will have to wait until after the pandemic.
Thank you very much. You're very welcome to Kazakhstan, by the way. We will be waiting for you at KIMEP University. So hopefully after pandemic, yes, maybe next year. Yeah. So there is the question from Eldar Kasenov. It's about the Joe Biden presidency. So what is the future for Chinese One Belt, One Road after the Joe Bidens win the US elections? Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that the presidential election in the United States has changed very little in China. What changed much more was the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has been a disaster for the world for so many reasons. For China, it definitely will cause many problems that they will have to face over years to come. And one of them is that many Belt and Road projects around the world are never going to make money after this pandemic, because many of the world's most vulnerable countries, which already didn't have the means to pay back their debt, now have absolutely no path to repay their debt. And these contracts will have to be renegotiated, and international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and the Asia Development Bank and sovereign lenders like the United States and Japan, everyone in the private sector, everyone who has lent money to low-income countries is going to have to take a haircut. There's money that they will never see back. And the Chinese will probably lose more than anyone. But coming out of the pandemic, and they came out of the pandemic faster than almost anyone else, I think they learned a few very important lessons. And the first is, this is an opportunity to tie off and kill the less effective parts of the Belt and Road, and to refocus our attention on the parts that get the best bang for the buck. So all of the indications are they're still talking about the Belt and Road. Xi Jinping gave a big speech in November where he pitched it, but it's going to focus less on big, very risky, long-term investments like the Korgas Gateway project or these Central Asian railway projects. And it's going to focus on public health, particularly vaccines, green technologies, and digital technology and services. I'm talking about 5G. I'm talking about the laying of undersea fiber optic cables, satellite navigation, mobile payment software, cloud computing, quantum computing, the really high-tech stuff. And I think China is realizing that it approached the Belt and Road in an inefficient way. It was probably too concerned with the political story that I was talking about earlier in this hour, and not concerned enough with actually being smart as an investor. And so I think moving forward, many of these projects that have been begun will be abandoned. And many that have been completed will be renegotiated, and China will just take the loss. And the future of the Belt and Road will be all about the trade in high-tech goods. And I think that is potentially a very effective thing, because as we've seen, lots of countries, including American allies and partners, need Chinese vaccines, even if they don't work particularly well. And they need green technologies if they're going to meet their Paris climate commitments, and everyone needs 5G. So it's not clear to me that the Belt and Road has died of coronavirus. I think that was American wishful thinking. And what the Biden administration has to confront is that the Belt and Road is coming out of this pandemic with the same name, but a completely different set of policy directions. And I think the Biden team has the right idea, that this should start by coordinating with allies, practicing diplomacy, listening to others, basically cleaning up the mess that the last administration left to it. But when it turns to China, it will have to find a way to hold China to account for the things that it is doing that are unacceptable, and Xinjiang is one of them. But also finding a way to collaborate with China on issues like climate change, where there is no alternative. We have to work together. And I think for that reason, the Biden team is going to not pay much attention to the Belt and Road for the next year or two, and that will give it an opportunity to keep expanding. That's a prediction, but I can come chat with you in a year or two, and you can see if I'm wrong.
Thank you so much. It would be really great if you would come in a year to talk to us and still continue this conversation. Here is a very good question from Dr. Fisher. When I was executive director of KIMAP from 1994 to 96, I wanted to visit China, which I did. My Kazakh staff was very much afraid of what might happen to me. They were truly afraid of the Chinese. Also, when a president of China visited Almaty, the city was in total lockdown. So something has changed. It seems that now the Chinese are much more welcome, even though there is a terrible problem with Xinjiang. Any comments? And he also goes like, thank you for a great presentation. Hope to meet you sometime in the future.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fisher, and thank you for the question. I hope to meet you too. And I do hope that we can continue this conversation past today. Look, having not been to Kazakhstan myself, I don't know how effectively I can answer this question, but I know from at least people I talk to in the policy and the academic space in the United States, the view seems to be, well, the Chinese are now the dominant power in Central Asia. They're supplying most of the critical infrastructure, particularly the high-tech infrastructure. They're buying the vast majority of the natural resources that are being produced. The United States is leaving Afghanistan just a few thousand troops at a time with its tail between its legs, having been defeated by the Taliban, and it's only a matter of time. And the Russians are trying to prevent China from building military facilities in these countries, but the Russians don't have the money or the interest to compete with China dollar for dollar. And so for all of the Central Asian republics, the only option has been to lean towards Beijing. And Beijing has become not only wealthier, but more demanding. And one of the things that it demands is access to Kazakh society. And it has the same demands of access in every other country where it operates. It's an unreciprocated access. The Chinese want access to you, and they don't want to give you access in return. And so Kazakhstan, as a small country, has had to make those trade-offs. And in a long-term perspective, I think the only solution is to do more creative diplomacy, so that Kazakhstan does not just become a satellite state of China, and that they have enough alternative sources of investment, enough trading partners, enough places where the most promising Kazakh young people can go to work or to study, technological partners and so forth. So that when the Chinese say, well, we want X, Y, and Z from you, that the Kazakhs can say, well, actually, we don't have to say yes so fast. But in the short term, I don't know if there's a solution, as I've said. I don't know how Kazakhstan could do much in the Xinjiang case, other than perhaps letting some of these survivors of the camps speak. But the indications are that China will look very unfavorably on that, and they will impose costs on this country if they let it happen. So that would be a sacrifice that Kazakhstan would be making on behalf of the Uyghurs and on behalf of the wider world.
Thank you very much, Eyck. And we have one more very interesting question from one of our colleagues, Saule Dusembina. Chinese employers do not seem to treat Kazakhstan workers very well. As evidence, there are numerous strikes in Kazakhstan. Do you know if the Chinese have similar attitude to the employees in other countries, or it is just the special policy for Kazakhstan? Thank you.
There have been many reports of this. Obviously, I don't know if you have ever had a boss. I've had bosses that I don't like. Most people don't like their bosses. So, you know, China is investing trillions of dollars all around the world. There's 2 million Chinese in Africa, right? There's God knows how many Chinese all over the world doing legitimate business purposes, supervising foreign staff. There's cultural differences. There's differences in management styles. It's not surprising that you get, you know, a few cases of nasty bosses. But it is true this seems to be a pattern. And even in some African countries like Ethiopia that have had very, very close commercial ties to China, there have been well-publicized stories of Chinese supervisors saying horrific racist things to their African employees, their Ethiopian employees. So it's hard to answer this as a general question. I mean, racism is a problem all over the world, but certainly it is not a good look for China's effort to tell its national story well. And the fact that you continue to see examples of racial insensitivity from the Communist Party. The last famous one was at their New Year's television special, which was, you know, it's the national thing that everyone watches on New Year's Day. They had people pretending to be Africans in blackface with their faces painted black. Like that's pretty bad. So I think there's a lot that the Communist Party can do in terms of learning cultural sensitivity. And that's definitely part of a process of the rest of the world thinking very hard about what it would be like to have the Chinese Communist Party have the same sort of power in the region of the world that they have at home. But I do think it is problematic to say, oh, here's a single case that we hear reported in a newspaper that all Chinese managers are that way. Because most Chinese are just people like you and me. And those who are working in Kazakhstan are just far from their families and trying to do their job.
Oh, thank you very much. And there is one more very interesting question regarding the presentation of the Jack Ma in 2018. Anonymous attendee is asking, thank you very much for your presentation. According to the Jack Ma of 2018, One Belt, One Road is mainly giving the small countries the benefits, such as giving them the opportunity to lead the globalization and giving them more job positions, which is different to your statement. What is your opinion about his speech? Thank you.
So I didn't deny that One Belt, One Road brings various opportunities to partner countries. Obviously, it is different in every case, and you have to look at on the country level and at the project level, case by case, and ask, is this a good investment? Is this actually the best and most strategic use of limited resources? But yes, obviously, if they do $2 trillion of investment around the world, meeting important human development goals, like they're going to do a lot of good. So this is something that I write in the book. I think it is possible to say, look, the Chinese Communist Party is in many ways a scary organization, and it has values that I don't like, and it's doing things in Xinjiang that are unconscionable and so forth, and still give it credit where it is participating in meeting needs of vulnerable people in low-income countries that cannot access capital from international lenders to build things like roads and schools and infrastructure. And I think that the United States and Europe and Japan and the other advanced economies need to think, well, if they want to push back against One Belt, One Road and say, well, we don't want you to, build our 5G networks, and we don't want you to do this and don't want you to do that. Well, what do we want China to do? Because China's the second largest economy in the world, and they have a lot of money that they want to put to work overseas, and that money is going to do something. So we might as well encourage China to do productive things for global development and celebrate China when it does those things. And I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we can recognize that there are many cases of countries that have benefited in particular ways from the Belt and Road, while also seeing that as a totality, it's a strategic problem or it's a strategic challenge that has to be very carefully managed.
Mr. Eyck, I'm sorry, we are running, we are almost finished. Is it possible to answer one more question, the last question? Yeah, very interesting question about there are many Americans of Chinese origin. What is their perception and attitude towards the role of China in the modern world?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'm not the one to speak to that. But I do know that there has been a very significant, sustained effort by the Chinese Communist Party to speak to overseas ethnic Chinese. And the Chinese call them Huayi. And they're understood to be part of the Chinese nation, even if their citizenship happens to be Dutch or Australian or Swedish or American. And this puts Asian Americans, particularly Chinese Americans, in a very difficult position. Look, I'm Jewish. I'm American. I grew up in New York. My family history is what it is. But if I were constantly being accused of dual loyalty, that maybe my true allegiance was to Israel rather than the United States, it would put me in a very uncomfortable position. I would feel very unwelcome. And if there were hate crimes, if people were shouting things at me or making white supremacist gestures at me, I would feel very unwelcome in the United States. And depending on my family's heritage and its relationship with China, maybe I would begin to look more favorably on what the Chinese Communist Party is saying. The United States has had Chinese immigration for well over 100 years. And there's a big difference between someone who's a fifth or sixth or seventh generation American, whose ancestors came in the 19th century, who've been American longer than my family has been American, and someone whose parents fled the Cultural Revolution in the 1970s, or someone whose parents were Shanghai, tech investors who moved, bought a condo in San Francisco 5 years ago. So these are not the same people, and they need to be, if China has to access them with different kinds of messages. But it is a very difficult problem because my country has an ugly history with race, very ugly history. And right now, I mean, just this week, we saw this horrific attack by a white supremacist on Chinese American women who did nothing wrong. And what is terrible is that this is this open wound in our society, and the Chinese Communist Party is actively picking at it on social media, in Chinese language, broadcasts that they're pushing to ethnic Chinese overseas to try to say the United States is a white supremacist society. The Western concepts of individualism and representative democracy and all of this, these are white supremacist colonial concepts. You are Chinese. Your true allegiance should be to the Chinese Communist Party. You should come home. We'll set you up if you come home. I'm very frightened at the trajectory of that because Chinese Americans make up some of the most talented people in my country, in our economy, in our universities, in our government, and it would be a terrible thing if we put them in an impossible situation. But that seems to be the direction and the strategy that the CCP is trying to take, and I don't really see how it gets better from here.
Okay, Eyck, thank you very much for today's conversation, and we have so many questions that were not answered. Unfortunately, we don't have time for those questions. And I would like having this opportunity, would like to thank Dr. Hartmut Fischer to find you for us. He has helped actually KMEP University with this initiative of the Global Leadership Forum a lot. And thank you very much, Dr. Fischer. And we would like to wish all the best for you in your future endeavors. And, you know, very soon you will become the PhD, yeah, you will become the graduate of the PhD. We wish you all the success and more books on, you know, like different perspectives of the China and Central Asia and One Belt, One Road, and maybe you will move further and also will think about the impact of the USA, yeah, in this region. And this is for us very interesting topic as well. And we would like to invite you also to KMEP one day. So maybe next semester, I don't know, next year, you're very welcome to KMEP University. And thank you very much again, yeah, on behalf of the program and the students and KMEP friends, we would like to thank you very much for today's conversation.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you all. You've been a great audience. The questions were terrific. Keep in touch, and all the best.